Our scripture reading today begins in the second chapter of Exodus in the 23rd verse, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard Bible today. Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out. And their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. And then from the Gospel of Mark in the 10th chapter, beginning in the 46th verse from the Message translation, we read, They spent some time in Jericho. As Jesus was leaving town, trailed by his disciples and a parade of people, a blind beggar by the name of Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting alongside the road. When he heard that Jesus the Nazarene was passing by, he began to cry out, Son of David, Jesus, mercy, have mercy on me. Many tried to hush him up, but he yelled all the louder, Son of David, mercy, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped in his tracks. Call him over. They called him. It's your lucky day. Get up. He's calling you to come. Throwing off his coat, he was on his feet at once and came to Jesus. Jesus said, What can I do for you? The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. On your way, said Jesus. Your faith has saved and healed you. In that very instant, he recovered his sight and followed Jesus down the road. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and to the hearing of his word. A few years ago, I sat in a clergy session where the presiding bishop had taken it upon himself to teach an auditorium full of pastors how to write a sermon. Now, before you begin to applaud, let me share with you his suggestions. He began with a statement that said something like, Each and every one of you has been provided a pastoral education fund to increase your ability to better communicate with your parish. I would like for each of you to take a portion of that fund and subscribe to the New York Times. Every front page headline is a sermon title. It's what's on the minds of those who are sitting in front of you. The research is done for you. All you need to do is interpret it to your congregation in a way that reflects the gospel truth. Now that indeed is one way to find a topic or a focal point for any sermon. My problem is, this is not the method I see Jesus using. There were newspapers of sort in those days. Go into any Christian bookstore, either on the street or online, and pick up a copy of Josephus, and you can read all the prevailing headlines in and around Israel and Judea. All during the time that Jesus walked this earth. Interestingly enough, Jesus addresses none of them. This doesn't mean he didn't have an opinion about any of them. It simply means he had bigger fish to fry. When Christ's church gets bitterly entangled in pro-choice, pro-life, gay rights, or any other issue that Jesus is silent on, it runs the risk of becoming a divisive weapon rather than a balm for healing and restoration. The mantra becomes, side with me and my opinion, or you're not a real Christian. When Christ's church gets bitterly entangled in these issues, we forget what the question of faith was in biblical days. Because the only true litmus test our Bible offers is the very simple question, do you believe? We amplify it a bit when we receive new members into our midst. We say, do you believe Jesus Christ is Lord? Do we believe he is the only begotten Son of God? Questions of orthodoxy go on, but the real question is, do we believe? Problems enter into our midst when we add those yes, but clauses. Do you believe? Yes, I believe. Yes, but But do you believe God created in literally 7 days? Do you believe that life begins at the very instant of conception? The yes but questions could be asked the remainder of this morning and half of this afternoon. Friends, these are questions that Jesus never asked. We're the ones that add the weight and the baggage to the simple statement that says, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Jesus' disciples share with us an account of his life, which we call the Gospels, or translating it to English, good news. They believe that in reading these recollections, our lives could be transformed just like theirs were. They saw no need to add the social concerns of the day to Jesus' story. The Gospels were sufficient for the edification and the transformation of God's people. So when we hear people asking us those yes, but questions, in whatever forms they present themselves, we need to understand the branding clarification is man-made, not God-ordained. Does this mean I should ignore the New York Times? Not necessarily. The moral compass of the church has accomplished great things throughout history, which is marked by those two little letters, A-D. By that same token, the church has done some fairly horrendous things in the name of Christ as well. We cannot be transparently honest and at the same time whitewash church history. While I rarely venture down this path, and you know I've been here for over 2 years, you don't see me preaching on a lot of social issues. I do believe it's important to take note of the social outcry taking place in our streets and our communities in this day. And while any of you could easily point out that Jesus never addressed this topic, I am mindful that unlike the society of his day, Jesus treated all persons equally, regardless their statement of faith, affliction, gender, or nationality. The topic I would like us to consider this day is the phrase that is found in 3 words that most every single one of us has heard over this past year. Black Lives Matter. This theme surfaced over a year ago with the shooting of an unarmed black youth. And since then it has been plagiarized, confiscated, watered down, and neutralized. Over the course of this past year, we began hearing the words, Black Lives Matter. Then it became All Lives Matter. Then it transgendered into Police Lives Matter. And then it was subsequently ironed out to easily say, Lives Matter. But you see, friends, when a primary truth is confiscated, it reflects the reality of the situation that brought it to the forefront. So before you ask me, but Brian, don't all lives matter? Or lives matter? Or police lives matter? The answer is an obvious yes, but that's not the point. It's far too easy for some of us to say, this is no big deal. These things have happened forever. And my response to that would be, you're right. It is no big deal, unless you happen to have been born black. Everything that you and I know today, we learned along those paths of yesterday. In our yesterdays, this nation did not share the common belief that black lives matter. As a matter of history, in fact, black lives mattered very little. Like women in biblical days, black lives were considered little more than personal property. All too often we look at our world history through rose-colored glasses. Now some might protest and say, but Brian, that was long, long, long before our time. The Voting Rights Act wasn't before our time. Colored versus white drinking fountains weren't before our time. The entire civil rights movement wasn't before our time. The supported conditions that led to that movement weren't before our time. Integration and the need for it wasn't before our time. Discrimination wasn't before our time. It is our time. And only those who wear rose-colored glasses has the Pollyanna belief that it has somehow all vanished in the last few years. Most every single one of us sitting in this sanctuary can easily remember 1967. It was the year of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was the year of flower power in California. It was the continuing struggle of the Vietnam conflict, because we were told not to call it a war. But people died nonetheless. It was also the year of a radical film that most of us today would yawn at watching. It required Hollywood royalty in order for the message to be seen, to be accepted, and to be embraced. It starred Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and Sidney Poitier. A very simple film with a title that asks the question, guess who's coming to dinner? Do you remember that film? The theme was quite simple. It was about a black man who wished to marry a white girl. They dared to wish to see themselves as equals. And if you'll remember, in 1967, most states in this country had laws on the books against such notions. Now let's go back to our scripture lesson. In the book of Exodus, we are told, the sons of Israel cried out because of their bondage. And God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant. If we were to take that passage and to paraphrase it into today's situation, it might read something like this. And the people in their persecution called out, "We matter. Notice us. See what's happening to us right under your noses. Will you really allow this to continue?" You see, friends, it's not that all lives don't matter. It's not that all cops are out to exterminate African Americans. They're not. And it's not that lives of policemen don't matter. They do. But that's not the issue. Their issue, that some would wish to hijack, is the same as Israel in the days before the Exodus under the nose of Pharaoh. And simply put, the question is raised. Will you continue to refuse to see what's happening before your very eyes and continue in your obstinance to ignore it? That's the question. Unarmed black men are routinely being gunned down, and nobody is doing anything about it. What brought national attention to the civil rights movement? Do you remember? It wasn't the beatings, the lynchings, the hangings, the burnings, or the hate speech, or the discriminating patterns that covered this country. Those have been going on for over 100 years without social comment, without social attention, without social uprising. So what made us open our eyes? Does anybody remember? It was 4 young, middle American, white boys who went to the South to help in the civil rights movement. And they were killed by the KKK. The televised media took note. The press took note. The government and elected officials took note in that order. And perhaps history will again need to repeat itself in that order. We know by the standards of world history, we rarely address a need. until there is something devastating that happens that forces our hand and our attention. So are you tired of seeing protests? People marching on police stations and instigators who take advantage of every opportunity by setting fires to things and stirring up trouble? Be a part of the solution and not the voice of Pharaoh saying, "Such little problems bother me not at all." In the Gospel of Mark, and from our scripture this morning, Jesus is leaving a very small town. Actually, it's more of a little cluster of a village called Jericho. And alongside the road is a noisy little nuisance. His name was Bartimaeus. And in that day, blind people were considered to be cursed, either by their actions or by something their parents had done. People were very superstitious in those days. But in this passage, we only see a cursed little noisy, begging nuisance on the side of the road. Or at least that's how the community saw him. And then along comes Jesus. Beggars in those days were easily thought of much the same as people think of beggars today. That person is a less than. And the crowds who were following Jesus, seeking truth and righteousness and God's love, spent their time walking past this individual, sternly warning Bartimaeus to shut up. They didn't want their master to hear the distraction. It interrupted their peaceful and prayerful time with Jesus. But Jesus does something unusual. In the 49th verse, Jesus stops and says, "Call him here." And upon Jesus' command, they say to the blind, noisy little less than, "Take courage, stand up. He's calling you." In the midst of his pilgrimage, Jesus stops a caravan of travelers and invests his time and effort in restoring an injustice, and then commands it in saying, "Go. Your faith has made you well." In the midst of ministry, hustled along by the crowds, Jesus sees the value in the plight of other individual lives. He brings the entire caravan to a halt to tend to the needs of one. As a society, we can be like Pharaoh and pretend to hear and see nothing. Like Pharaoh, with a voice of Yul Brynner from a Cecil B. DeMille movie, we can take note of an incident or two and say to ourselves, "How unfortunate." Or like Jesus, we can declare another seemingly insignificant individual who looks nothing like us to be of worth and value and significance. There are several sayings floating around the press and televised media corps this day. Lives matter. Police lives matter. All lives matter. But if we're diligently and historically honest, we'll admit they got it right the first time. Black lives matter. Now, will I preach on a social issue next Sunday? Probably not. The Church of Jesus Christ is commissioned to proclaim his eternal words and acts found throughout the Gospels in the world in which we live. This, however, does not mean that his church is silent. It means to be fruitful, it retains its primary focus while addressing injustices without negating its primary mission. We, like those in the Gospel of Mark, can be so focused on our personal intent that we fail to hear the plight of those immediately around us. And when we do, we sometimes shush them for making too much noise and distracting us. Unlike Pharaoh or those in that crowd, God calls us to be different, to be attentive, to be bold, to live His discerning compassion. In whatever ways God leads, you and I are called in this world to be the living presence of Christ. In our homes, in the marketplace, and in our communities. However that presence unfolds and reveals itself is between God and our willingness to be His witness in whatever situation He places us. In any and in all of these events, may we be mindful of His Spirit, His guidance in our words and our deeds, for both now and every day to come.